Okay.
Assalamu alaikum, Sidi.
Alaikum assalam. This is very exciting times. We are in the aftermath of battles and anticipating more. Lots going on here in the text and in the world. So exciting doesn't always mean necessarily that I approve of what's going on in the world, but it's these are really remarkable moments, remarkable times we're living in. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And the depiction of Uhud here is just really intense.
Absolutely.
Consultations and disagreements and turning of
Infidelity.
the tides. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, this is it's one of the things about the Quran is that it's the story of the Quran and what the Quran is dealing with is just so real and at times so relatable to what's happening even in the world today. I guess the
Mhm.
human condition doesn't really. I'm not one who subscribes to the idea that we are morally evolving. I think we're just we've done a great job of industrializing the violence, but it seems that as a species we're even with indoor plumbing and French perfume, we're still pretty barbaric in the way we treat each other. So it's
Yeah.
there's something very relatable about all of this as we bring it home. And alhamdulillah. All right.
Yeah.
So
What you say there reminds me of MLK Jr. His we have guided men, or we have guided missiles, but misguided men.
yeah.
So the moral
Yeah.
progress is not kept up with the technological.
No, not at all. In fact, in some ways, we're even more barbaric than previous generations. The mission and vision of the American Islamic College, to me, pretty much now synonymous with the work. I believe in the transformative power of education, and not just education that is informative, but in education that is transformative, education that really changes how we live. But I think that the Muslims of America need a place that they can come as a Muslim space. This is their space. It belongs to them. Assalamu alaikum. For the first time, I noticed the background music in that video. So I was, mashallah. It was, in spite of the fact that I hate listening to my own voice, it's, I started to hear the music in the background. So it was, had a different feel tonight. All right. Assalamu alaikum. This is night 4 of Layali Ramadan, of the nights of Ramadan. So we are, as we've spoken in previous episodes of this conversation, we're following the traditional portioning of the Quran in a very loose way as we journey through these 30 nights, and these portions are moving in a somewhat counter chronological way. So we're almost moving backward in time when we think about the 23-year period during which we believe the Prophet Muhammad was receiving these revelations from the angel Gabriel little by little, and gradually this whole recitation was coming into being, was being formed. And so tonight we're dealing with some really real life stuff, as we know that the community the community of the Quran has lived through some battles, one that went miraculously well and one that was a terrible and disheartening defeat. We know that the community is now needing guidance about inheritance and about marriage and about divorce and about almsgiving and many other things. And so we're seeing that the Quran is, these are, in spite of the fact that we have these spiritual jewels embedded throughout, there's a lot of practical guidance happening here. And so here we are finishing the third surah called the family of, the third surah called the family of Imran, and which is the family of Mary, and then beginning the surah of the women. So Mahan, what speaks to you here in the family of Imran?
So, we've got the second half of this third surah more or less ahead of us, and you can see how it shifts. The opening, which has some parallels to how Al-Baqarah began, and then the contrast where it more addresses what we would call Christianity, Mary, and Jesus, the Ahl al-Kitab more broadly, the peoples of the book. And you can see clearly very much in the middle, it's got 200 verses. And when you move past 100, and actually verse 100 itself, it immediately turns to Ya ayyuhal ladhina amanu. So you can see the change of address to those who profess to believe, the believers. And I'd like to begin with 102, which is really recited quite often. Ya ayyuhal ladhina amanu. So, oh, you who believe. Ittaqullaha haqqa tuqati. As you hear it, you even hear the alliteration. Reverence God as he should be reverenced. This is the translation in
that's a nice translation
in the study of Qur'an. Reverence God as he should be reverenced.
And do not
and then
die.
later on, who can do that, right? It's impossible. But later on, the Quran will say, fattaqullaha mastata'tum, to your capacity, like as much as you can, because no one can fully fulfill that right. But here it's presented in this, as he should be reverenced, and die not except in a state of submission. Because can you imagine being in a state of transgression and you don't even sustain your own life? You're not the living. You're given life and it's leaving you. And be in a state of submission, because that is the state in which you want to meet your Lord. And if you fight it until the end, thinking that you're something greater than you are, I mean, the arrogance being the prime sin, it's that's the wrong way to go.
Well, and also, I was just going to add here that death is in the air in this Quranic context as well, because of the battles. So we're going to see other verses that talk about those who have died, those who are fighting, for a noble cause and God's cause. That we should not think of them as if they're dead, but there's this idea of living in a state of preparation for death. And then as we continue this, I preached on this next verse, the idea of holding fast to the rope of God altogether and not be disunited, right? The rope of God to me is just one of the most compelling and graphic images in the Quran for me. And it's the idea that that no matter what's happening, even when everything else has failed us and we're disillusioned and we're that there's still this idea of holding on to the rope of God. And then there's this beautiful part of that verse right afterwards, this calling back to mind, remember that you were enemies of each other in this tribal world of Arabia. You were enemies of each other and God made you brothers, right? So don't be disunited. And this counsel against becoming disunited seems to me to be like a very strong theme, in these passages.
Right. Yeah. And the hadith, the saying of the Prophet that we invoked in the beginning, the long one from Ali, that there will be some strife and what's the way out, and it's the book of God and its wonders never cease and scholars are never satiated. It says that the Quran is وَهُوَ حَبْلُ اللَّهِ الْمَتِينَ, like it is the rope of God. And so this is according to at least one interpretation, the Quran itself, God's revelation, that
Mm.
when when Adam was banished, also which we saw in the first night, from or sent down to
From
dwell on the earth, in enmity even, and the angels had already seen that we would be a being and a creature that sheds blood. Um, um, the the antidote to that is, uh, if فَإِمَّا يَأْتِيَنَّكُم مِّنِّي هُدًى, when guidance comes to me from you.
Mm.
And so we're living in this state of strife, but then our way out, our salvation, is by hanging on to God's guidance, which is through revelation. So
That's right. That's right. And God didn't leave, Adam without guidance. The moment he was cast out was the moment that he was given guidance.
right,
In a way, the rope descended right at that moment. And
right.
so humankind was never without a rope.
And here, where it says, فَأَلَّفَ بَيْنَ قُلُوبِكُمْ, that God is the one who reconciled your hearts when you were in this tribal enmity. It's an indication, I think, to us to let go. As long as we're holding on, it's our agency, it's our need, it's our right, it's our opinion. If I can only get you to see it my way, this is not how reconciliation ultimately happens. Um, muqallib al-qulub, God is the one who
Flips the hearts.
flips the hearts.
Yeah.
And at some point, there must be this reverence or almost a release of letting go. And that's a heart that's submissive, but also humble and prayerful. And with that kind of an approach, you get breakthroughs uh, that come from places that we don't ultimately have a mastery over.
Hmm. Now, before we went on air tonight, Mahan, you had mentioned to me the fact that the verses that talk about enjoining the good and forbidding the evil or the wrong, that they kind of really stood out for you. So do you want to talk about that for a minute?
Sure. Well, the next verse here, it says, let there be from amongst you an ummah. There's the word again, like a nation or a group, a community, from amongst you. So it's not necessarily everybody, but there needs to be at least a sufficient number. And they call, يَدْعُونَ إِلَى الْخَيْرِ, they call to what is good and what is wholesome, good, pure, and beautiful. And they command what is right and forbid what is wrong, not in an arrogant way, because I always trouble with this. Like, if you're commanding what is right, you're going around like, the moral police, with a sense that you have the moral code. And I always trouble with this contradiction. But so it needs to be coupled with humility, but nonetheless, there needs to be an ethical compass, a moral compass that guides that community, and that they engage the world through it, um, rather than just through power or through might, which is how we see nations acting in the world today, but genuinely through moral code, not just deploying moral vocabulary as a veneer for self-interest, but it must be flow genuinely. I mean, I don't know if such a world is possible in a realist world, which is full of pragmatism and self-interest. But at least we are called towards it,
Yeah.
and the Quran is inviting us to take that call seriously. That they command what is right and forbid what is wrong or good, and forbid what is evil. And those are the people who will ultimately succeed. Like, they might fail in the world, and if God wants them to succeed in the world, but ultimately it's not the world that we're after. And then later on in this was 104, but in verse 110,
Yeah, we see it again.
you see it again. that you and the community of the Prophet is being addressed directly. Kuntum khayra ummatin ukhrijat linnas. You're the best community that has been raised up for humankind. But why? Because of the enjoining of what is good and forbidding of what is wrong. The community practices, has an actual moral code, and tries to live by it. And
This reminds me
yeah,
very much of the Aristotelian concept of friendship in the Nicomachean Ethics, that friends come together not because they necessarily um, uh, that the highest form of friendship, according to Aristotle, are two people who love the good, and then they encourage one another in pursuit of the good, so that there's a triangular structure to friendship, that
mm,
the friends are here, but they're both exhorting one another and calling one another to be better and to the good, and in that exhortation, and that's the highest love of friendship. And so that when two people love the good, and then they are friends, I guess, within the context of that love of the good, then that's the highest form of friendship. And I think religiously, this is in a way very much what the Quran is describing. It's describing a community that is always going to be in process. People are always going to be imperfect, but the community is helping one another be better, right? And they're doing that because they've been given guidance about what is good. Here literally what is known, or what is ma'ruf, what is good and wholesome, and what is detrimental, like what is toxic and what is bad, and helping each other stay away from what is bad, and helping each other remember and pursue what is good. To me is a beautiful way of thinking about what friendship means within a religious context.
right, right.
Mm.
And again, I'm just going. What I struggle with is I feel like this language can frighten people, and sometimes it frightens me, and I'll tell you why. Because you're afraid of this moral police, right? That's self-righteous and is always going around saying this is good and this is bad, and we see religious people do this. But I reconcile this imperative to engage the world on the basis of ethical principles with the understanding that there's often ambiguity, and that what's good from my perspective might be horrific from your perspective, right? Because of our different standpoints, our different formations, maybe even cultures and sensibilities. And so then I think what this is saying to me is have a conversation, a dialogue, and engage each other on trying to develop a shared understanding of the good. Because if you're engaging the world from that standpoint, you're putting ethics at the center. And part of good ethical teaching is you speak to each other well, you don't self-aggrandize, you don't humiliate, right? There are all these other principles that the believers, and we'll see in Surah Furqan, وَعِبَادُ الرَّحْمَنِ الَّذِينَ يَمْشُونَ عَلَى الْأَرْضِ هَوْنًا. The servants of God are those who walk on the earth humbly. And
Yeah.
so the scary part of like people going out commanding what is right and forbidding what is wrong is balanced by all of these teachings that bring you down back to earth. Um,
Right.
yeah,
And we've all had scary experiences where somebody out of the blue came up to criticize us for trimming our beard a particular way, or thinking that they're fulfilling this commandment, thinking that they're in
right,
a position to judge categorically, and to pick on others in a condescending way. And that I was think that pushes people away from the religion as opposed to
right,
inviting them in deeper. And
yeah,
all of this really is about helping each other uh, journey forward, right? Journey
right,
forward in goodness, journey forward in faith, journey forward in love, And when verses like this are misused, they do just the opposite, right? They just turn
Right.
people off and push people away.
Right. And the way to check this really is through encounter and through interaction, mutual consultation, always being in community. And instead of being one-sided, we've got a lot of one-sidedness where people are just on pulpits and there's no interaction and no critique, and they're surrounded by people who only say yes and assent and revere, um, but this genuine kind of being constantly challenged with your own views. This requires formation, and it requires institutions, and it requires a kind of community, even civilization, that nurtures that and protects that, which institutions can help us in. So anyways, that's my thing. Just a little aside on the need to be ethically centered, but also to be humble and never so self-assured that you've got it all figured out. The other place, that we're talking about, the aftermath of the second major battle, where in this one, the Prophet and his companions, they suffered, by all accounts, defeat. But initially the battle was going their way, and there was a whole consultation before they engaged in the battle on what the strategy should be, and there was differences of opinion, and some people were disgruntled because their opinion wasn't taken, and the Prophet gave certain commands that weren't ultimately followed, but they were disobeyed in the best of intentions, but nonetheless there was a breakdown in the discipline. And so all of that is being addressed in these verses. But at one point the rumor spreads that the Prophet himself, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, may the peace and blessings of God be upon him, has fallen in battle. And this deeply demoralized the army. So the verse, this is number 144, I believe.
Yeah, it's 144.
It reminds, it's a very powerful reminder, and one of the 4 places in the Quran where Muhammad by name is mentioned. There's a 5th where you get Ahmad, a variant, in Surah Al-Saf, but there are 4 places where Muhammad is mentioned by name, and this is one of them. وَمَا مُحَمَّدٌ إِلَّا رَسُولٌ. Muhammad is none other than a messenger. Messengers have gone by before him. If he were to die, أَفَإِن مَاتَ, or slain, killed, would you turn your heels and run? Like, would the mission is greater than the man? This is a hugely clarifying moment that Allahu Akbar, God is greater than even this. And so whosoever then turns and runs, then they can't harm God in the least. Ultimately, you're in the path of God, and God will surely recompense those who are grateful. So this is a clarifying moment. And I remember we were talking about this also just briefly before we entered the session, that when the Prophet actually passed away, some people were deeply traumatized and weren't willing to accept it. And Umar, who becomes the second caliph, powerful man, but also a very emotional man, wasn't willing to accept that the Prophet is gone. And so Abu Bakr at that point, who was the first caliph, this is what we learned from tradition.
And the Prophet's best friend.
And the best friend and his companion in the cave, and he recited this verse that Muhammad is nothing but a messenger. Messengers have gone by before him, if he were to die or to be slain. And it immediately calmed Umar. and he's like, as if it's revealed for the first time for me.
Yeah.
And so this is the awesome power of revelation when it's recited in the right way, and at the right moment. So there's a note there on the humanity of the Prophet,
Yeah.
sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right?
Yeah. Beautiful.
Uh,
I also
and then
like in.
yeah,
Go ahead.
no, go ahead, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say I also like in this chapter of the Quran with there is certainly criticism of the the infidelity that was witnessed by and the hypocrisy that was witnessed within the Jewish community and within the Christian community and within the the long histories of those communities. But the Quran is always fair-minded in reminding the community that not everyone is the same, right? And like in 113, they are not all alike. Among the followers of the book, that would be the Jews and the Christians, there are upright people, right, who recite God's communications in the night, and they adore God, and they believe in God in the last day, and they command what is right, and they forbid what is wrong, and they strive with one another in hastening to do good deeds, and then those are among the good. And whatever good they do, they shall not be denied it. And God knows those who guard against evil. There's another verse at the end of the surah that's very similar, and so it's to me consoling that the criticism that we found and the kind of as the the identity of the Muslim community is emerging in distinction and contradistinction to these other communities, and there is some criticism that is dished out with regard to certain bad behaviors that the Quran does not want the Muslims to repeat or to perpetuate. And yet there's this fairness about the Quranic handling of Jews, Christians, Sabians, those who believe in God and who live righteously, that there's a recognition that that there are people within these communities that are beautiful believers, and they adore God, they love God, they worship God, they do what is right, and they discourage people from doing what is wrong, and that God will not deny them the good that they've
Right.
done. I love
Yeah.
that.
That is beautiful. And at the same time, it's also saying that, and within the community of believers that's with the Prophet, there are those who say they believe but they don't.
Right.
And so it's a beautiful mirror that, look, none of this is black and white, and keep things in proper perspective. So that's a great reminder that the black and white vision with which many people approach communities and difference is something that the Quran is very much complicating. And then
Mhm.
this is, I believe, 159. I have to say, I mean, this is one of my favorite places in the Quran, where it's a statement on really prophetic leadership, and it's an invitation for us to all think about leadership. Fabima, you had this terrible defeat, right? And it was because of dissension, disobedience, all kinds of problems that of character, even, right? And some just mistakes of innocence, but nonetheless, where discipline broke down, and the Prophet is being commanded to be merciful to the followers,
Yeah.
even though he's the Prophet who receives revelation. And it is by the mercy of God that you were lenient with them. If you had been harsh and hard-hearted, they would have left you. And so, I mean, the lesson here is, even if you have revelation coming to you,
Hmm.
you have to have right conduct with those to whom whose allegiance you're commanding. It's not enough to have the truth, to be right, um, but rather you must have a certain way with people. But if you don't, even if you have God's revelation, they will scatter. They leave you.
Mm.
وَلَوْ كُنْتَ فَظًّا غَلِيظَ الْقَلْبِ, if you've been harsh and hard-hearted, لَانْفَضُّوا مِنْ حَوْلِكَ, they would have left you. And
Mm.
so the advice to the leader is forgive them and ask forgiveness for them. Like, don't just forgive them, and turn to God and say, God, please forgive them. I mean, this is the next level. Get
Mm.
rid of any feelings of, that this was
Resentment or yeah.
resentment, and continue to include them. وَشَاوِرْهُمْ فِي الْأَمْرِ, in future, mutual consultation in the future. Don't discard them or make them outcast. But when you died, you continue to be in this way. But when you make a decision, put your faith in God and the people, not in فَتَوَكَّلْ عَلَى اللَّهِ. Like, He is the sovereign, ultimately.
Mm.
And then God loves those who put their trust in Him. So I love that verse. It's a terrific reminder of I think the highest leadership qualities, just encapsulated very, very simply. And maybe the
Mm.
last thing here, I don't know, I'm jumping, so you can stop me, but I'm just going to introduce this last one, and it comes back to your observation in the end of, how the Quran speaks about believers and the peoples of the book. But this last section is again a prayer, very much like the last section of Al-Baqarah was a prayer, the surah before it. So you can see the parallelism in structure. And in fact, the concluding section of this surah begins exactly the same way, with the same words as the concluding section of Al-Baqarah. وَلِلَّهِ مُلْكُ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ, and to God belong the heavens and the earth, and He has power over all things. In the creation of the heavens and the earth, and the alternation of the night and the day,
Okay.
there are signs for those who are endowed with deep insight, those who remember God, standing and sitting and lying down,
Mm.
basically in every state, and who reflect on the creation of the heavens and the earth. And one of the reasons I love this verse is because it combines the dhikr and fikr. For those who don't know, like the remembrance of God and intellecting
Yeah.
about nature. Excuse me.
Yeah. And so when they contemplate the creation of the heavens and the earth, they say, "Oh Lord, you've not created this batilan. You've not created this in vain."
In
Like
vain.
they see purpose and
They see
balance,
purpose.
and
Right.
yeah.
And what we see today is you've got some groups who just sit for the remembrance of God, and they're not really thinking carefully about the empirical world, the material world, and what it's teaching us, and the different ways in which it's unveiling itself to us in ways that are very different from past generations. And then there are those who are just looking at the material world and who study it empirically, but they forget God. And this verse brings the two together. It's like you got to keep them together, and then
Yeah.
you will see purpose. You see something that the combination of the two approaches will show you that neither one nor the other by itself can fully.
Mm.
And so glory be to you. وَقِنَا عَذَابَ النَّارِ, and save us from the fire. I mean, there's that, what this tells me, I don't focus on the fire. What this tells me is that what they're thinking is that there's more consequences. There's a moral consequence to my existence. And I have duties and I have obligations. I must live righteously. I can't just live frivolously. And so these verses, when they were revealed, the Prophet wept. And when he was summoned for the morning prayer by the muezzin, he found the Prophet weeping and said, "What's happened?" He's like, "These verses were revealed to me." So it's a beautiful, this section, this last section, this surah is a beautiful um, prayer. And then, it says that there's if you look at even the sequence, that there's a recognition of God, and almost an innate recognition of God. But then the messenger comes afterwards. Like there's almost a receptivity. I'm ready for, Lord, I see, I'm ready. And then Rabbana innana sami'na munadiyan yunadi lil iman. So my Lord, we have heard the call of the caller calling towards assent to your revelation, which is tasdiq bima ja'a bihi nabi. This is the definition of iman. Like we have heard the call of the caller inviting us to assent to your revelation, and so we believe, we assent. Lord, our Lord, forgive us our sins. So again, there's this sense that balil insanu ala nafsihi basira, the human being kind of sees as his own soul. And so forgive us our sins. I realize I'm imperfect and I've made mistakes and I continue to make mistakes. Forgive my conduct, and then cover up our faults, and again cause us to meet our ultimate end with the righteous, with a community of submission, ma'al abrar. And so then they're
Nice.
promised paradise. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, no. It's yeah, no. This is. Are there any questions or comments that we want to respond to before we move into the surah of the women, Surah An-Nisa?
I don't see any, but feel free if there are people who are tuning in. If you have any questions or if you would like to comment, please go ahead and do so. And we'd love to share them and interact with you. But just maybe the last thing, and because this last part of this surah is, it's again, remember the previous surah ended with, and give us victory over the kafirin.
Yeah.
And we have to understand carefully what that means. But here again, it goes right after that into, don't let the prancing about of those who reject God's light in the earth sort of grieve you or deceive you that somehow they are on the right because they have worldly glory and power. The mata'un qalil, this is a brief moment of enjoyment, but the end is not going to be an ultimate end in the final abode. It won't be of this kind. But those who have had regard of their Lord, they will be in gardens of bliss and in paradise where they abide. And then amongst the book goes back to, those who are typically understood to be Jews and Christians, people who've been given the book. There are those who believe in what has been sent down to you. Like they recognize that there's a divine here, but they also continue to believe in what had come to them. It's a really interesting formulation. And they are truly fearful of their Lord, and they don't barter away his signs for a cheap price. Basically, they don't bargain away God's messages for some worldly gain. They stick to their principles. They are ulaika lahum ajruhum, and so they'll have their reward with their Lord.
They'll have the reward.
Yeah, and God is swift in his reckoning. And so there's another very beautiful and conciliatory tone here towards the end of this surah. And then the different isbiru, asabiru, arabitu, it's easy to give up. Don't give up.
Yeah.
Stand firm, and that you may you may triumph and succeed. So the end of the surah, I didn't want to just let it go because I just feel it's so
That's
such
okay. I
a
can see that. It's beautiful.
yeah.
It's really it's beautiful. And then even after those beautiful words about the peoples of the book, it comes back to the community and say, okay, so you know, remain steadfast and be patient and and be careful, be mindful of your duty to Allah, to God, so that you
Right.
might be successful. And then we transition to the Surah of the Women, and it's kind of ironic that we have two bearded men here talking about the Surah of the Women. And I hope as Ramadan unfolds, I'm hoping that we'll have other guests and other scholars and other thinkers joining us, male and female, joining us as we journey through the Quran in this way. But just the first verse of this. I mean, the Surah of Women is very important for many, many reasons. And the Quran being a text that was orally revealed over 23 years, as we remember, it repeats itself. And so the Quran has that oral signs of an oral recitation. So, you know, we'll find Jesus and the stories of Jesus and Mary kind of reflected in different parts of the Quran, and we'll have other things that are often repeated. But here is also where we find the singular mention of the possibility of multiple marriage as a solution. That is, a man marrying more than one woman within that pre-Islamic Arabian or within that Arabian context. It's only in one, that permission is only given in one place, and it's given in a very specific way, in a context that is concerned for the well-being of orphans. And so remembering that the community has already had two battles, that many fathers have died, and that the community, having fled their hometown, or at least half of them had fled their hometown of Mecca to where they were persecuted, to the refuge city of Medina. And then it was, once they're in Medina, that's when the battles began. And that for a newly widowed wife and mother to go back to her family would have meant going from monotheism back to the idolatry and polytheism of Mecca, going back to her family. And so there's a problem that the community is facing, and so the Quran gives this permission, but is explicitly within a context about fearing for the well-being of orphans, fearing for the well-being, not in the sense, I think, that men should be marrying those kids, those orphans, but in the idea that those families, the way we care for those families is by integrating them with our own and bringing them into our own. But as we just begin this surah, it's really powerful when we read, you know, oh people. So this is how sometimes the Quran will refer, oh you who believe, oh peoples, people of Israel, the descendants of Jacob, the Banu Israel, oh peoples of the book. But here it's all humankind, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And can I just
Go ahead.
as you read this, I just want to point out, this is the very beginning of the next chapter, which is the chapter 4 on women, and just contrast the way it's beginning to the way the first the two major Medinan verses surahs began. There it was, Alif Lam Mim, which we didn't talk about. And then Nazzal alayka al-kitab, dhalika al-kitab. Like, this is the book. There's like an opening, address. And now, as Dr. Timothy reads, you'll see a shift in the next two surahs. Oh, people, the surah begins. Oh, people, like direct. So I just wanted to point out, some of these subtleties and shifts.
Yeah. And it's like all people. It's not just like one group of people. It's like the collective word in the Quran to mean all humankind, right? Be vigilantly mindful of your Lord who created you min nafsin wahida, right? And then created from her, because nafs, that is, sorry, I slipped into the Arabic there, but who created, be vigilantly mindful of your Lord who created you from a single soul. Now, soul is feminine in Arabic. And so it says, and from her, from the soul, he created her mate. And then from the two of them issued forth countless women and men. And be mindful of your Lord, through whom you seek things from one another. You make requests of one another, and be vigilantly mindful of the wombs that gave birth to you. Surely God is always watching over you. So we've got so people, humankind is being commanded not only to be vigilantly mindful of God, but also vigilantly mindful of their mothers. The fact that we all came from a mother, and that this is so rich. But I love this language of, remember, be vigilantly mindful of your Lord who created you from a single soul. And this speaks to me, to the intimate interconnectedness of the entire human family, right? And that we are all children of that soul, right? That one soul, and that universal human connection is just so beautifully and poetically captured here in this language.
Yeah, and the femininity of that verse,
Yeah.
the soundscape, and as you read it in this gendered way, the chapter is also called Women and Nisa,
Right.
and there'll be a lot here about family, about issues of justice, and those who are considered marginalized, orphans, right?
Yeah. And so this is, I mean, I could spend a whole evening just sort of contemplating this single soul and the interconnectedness of the entire human family. And then the surah goes right into a discussion of orphans. And it's there that already in the third verse, and here's where that permission comes. If you are afraid for the well-being of orphans, if you feel that you cannot act equitably or justly toward orphans, then permission is given, then marry, right? Up to 2, 3, or 4. But if you fear that you will not be able to do justice between those families, between them, then marry one, right? That is more proper. And so there's this command that sometimes when people and Muslims are guilty of this too, but sometimes people take cheap shots at Islam because of the polygamy and the way polygamy is approached and practiced. But it's really clear that in the Qur'an, it's not about the male thirst for variety, and it's not about male privilege, and it's not about it. There's this deep concern for the well-being of the vulnerable. And that's where the permission comes from. And it only comes once in the Quran. There's only one place. And so, and woven right into those verses is a command to be absolutely equitable and just. If that situation emerges, and later on we're going to read that it's impossible for human beings to be perfectly just, to love equally, and to be, and so the overwhelming kind of preference then is for monogamy, but it is understood that in certain extreme situations there needs to be permission for multiple marriage. And so to me, I think that as disturbing as some of the propaganda can be, and even sometimes as disturbing as the attitudes of Muslims can be with regard to Muslim men in particular, but it can be disturbing how they kind of make up their own reasons and their own justifications and their own whimsical justifications for this. The Quran is very clear, right? This is about orphans. It's about the vulnerable, and it's about taking care of each other. It's not about anything else. And to me, that was the Quran really addressed that concern of mine in a way that I really deeply appreciate it.
Yeah. No, this is a great explanation, and I think a couple of things as we wrap up here. to think about is, first of all, prophetic practice. Like the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, may the peace and blessings of God be upon him, was himself monogamous for the first, in the prime of his youth,
That's right.
and so that is, a standard from that point of view. And then secondly, if you look at Revelation from a historical perspective, that the guidelines here are actually a restriction to the complete kind of openness to such practices that were present before. And so the Quran, for those who read in Revelation, this kind of progressive model, is that the Quran is bringing us towards a more restrictive, even legal position on this question, and then narrowing it even further with this kind of moral imperatives around the reasons for it. So this is all very helpful. I just see this one question here on the question of basira, and whether someone like Dr. Israr, talk more about this, and he certainly did. Basira being a kind of inner, light through which we're illuminated and see things clearly. And when it comes up again, inshallah, there'll be more occasion to speak about this. But thank you for your question. And I think we can bring it to a close here for tonight. What do you think?
Yeah, no, we're at 50 minutes. It goes fast. I mean, at least for us. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe the people who are with us online are dying to have this finished. But certainly for me, it goes fast. It's yeah. So I'm so grateful that we have this opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Timothy, and thank you to all for being back with us. Inshallah, we'll see you tomorrow night. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Wal asri innal insana lafi khusr illa alladhina amanu wa amilus salihati wa tawasaw bil haqq wa tawasaw bis sabr. Sadaqallahu al-azim.
All right.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam. Ramadan Mubarak, everyone.